Oh, God.
I went out my save the dates for the wedding recently, didn't I, Katie? I sent you
Yes,
one.
very exciting.
So to create this save the date, I did it myself. I asked ChatGPT, first of all, to create a certain image of a bride and groom, which I thought would be quite fun. So ChatGPT created this image. And then I went on Canva, removed the background, and added all these funky things to make this kind of fun little save the date. I sent it to Will and was like, what do you think? Are you happy with this? He was like, yeah. I sent it to my mum. What do you think of this? She was like, yeah, that's cute. Sent it out to everybody yesterday. My best friend has just replied, do you realize you've got 3 legs?
What? No, I have to look.
3 legs? Go on.
No, no, that can't be right.
And that's just,
Oh my God, that's the funniest thing.
I said I've just said that to everyone.
You cannot, yeah, that is actually hilarious. But I think because
No one
it's
else has
not,
noticed.
no, I didn't notice.
You know what's quite funny as well? At the bottom, I put the date on a little banner. And originally, the banner kind of covered the bottom of our feet. And I was like, oh, that looks a bit messy. So I actually shrunk
Wow.
the picture in the middle to expose my 3 feet. I still didn't notice.
That is, I love that. That's the best thing. I can't believe I didn't clock that. Oblivious. But that's a good thing.
Well, this just sets the tone for my wedding, doesn't it?
Yeah, just relax. You and your 3 feet. And it's a different shoe. But that's
Oh, is it really?
It would be, it's a different shoe, yeah.
Well, maybe that could be someone in the background's foot, but you can't see them because they're behind me and my dress, but their foot is poking through.
Sure, that makes it better.
Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. I didn't even clock that. That's so good.
Oh, man. Oh, anyway, hope you enjoyed that one,
That was
guys.
good. I like that. Absolutely nothing, obviously, what we're talking about today. This topic, you put it forward literally 2 days ago.
So I had a conversation with someone in my family or Will's family, which is going to soon be my
Soon
family.
be
I kind of
yours.
already asked. Anyway, around this at Christmas time. And that's where it sparked this idea to create an episode around it. It's the difference between disordered eating and an eating disorder. Because I mentioned the term disordered eating, and this person hadn't heard that term before, wasn't really aware of what that was. And that was really interesting for me because that opened my eyes to a different reality because we work in this field, it's the stuff we talk about all the time, we read books on it, etc. So for me, disordered eating is just like a term that I assumed everybody knew, but that's because
Yeah.
I'm living in the echo chamber where everybody I follow online is talking about this stuff. So that creates the reality for me that everyone does know what this is and the idea of diet culture. Whereas these terms were new for this person. So we had a whole conversation about what it is. And I did actually say, I might do an episode on this. So they have had a heads up that I should do this. And then just the other week at uni, we also had a lecture around eating disorders. And again, she spoke kind of about a little bit about the difference between disordered eating and an eating disorder. And a lot of people left that lecture going, oh God, that was so interesting. I didn't know any of those things. I didn't really know anything about eating disorders. Like I learned loads. And for me, I left being like, oh, well, that was handy. She told us about them, but
Mm.
I wanted a bit more meatiness. So yeah, it's just really opened my eyes to that there is maybe a world of a different world that we're not aware of that doesn't talk about these things in the way we do and use this terminology. I mean, I guess a lot of people who are listening to us might, but I'm hoping it's still helpful for us to have that conversation about what's the difference between the two.
Even when you say that, to me, it feels like more of a spectrum. than
Mhm.
like a definitive black and white.
Yes.
Like it's not necessarily textbook, and I think a lot of it comes down to your own experience and how something is impacting you. Because I've used the term eating disorder and disordered eating in my own experience somewhat interchangeably, but because when I look back, I would say that there are times where, for me, I was in an eating disorder because it took over my life. It controlled me more than I controlled it. My thoughts around food, my behaviors around food, it dominated my life. And then I had periods of time where it was less so. And that felt more like my eating is definitely disordered and I have disordered thoughts around food, but it's not as overpowering as it has been. I'm saying this, I don't think I necessarily identify with each side. I don't think I'm talking about it like that. But when I think about how I view it in my own experience, I know when it crossed over into the line of like, this is now something that's consuming me and it's becoming something that I'm identifying with. And I'm always thinking about food and I have quite a few rules around food and I can't detour from that. But then when it comes to disordered eating, I have to really watch myself because I notice it. Well, I say I notice it. When I see the way other people are around food or the way that they talk about food, my brain will be like, that's disordered. That to me
Mhm.
feels very disordered. But is that just me from my experience and knowing that to me that would be disordered because it would probably then escalate? Or is that actually a behavior that's disordered? Right. So the difficulty with this is, as I say, it's a spectrum. I think you'd probably agree with that. And I think a lot of it comes down to lived experience. And that's just me talking about it from my own experience. But what about you, Becca?
I think what you mentioned there about you hear people say stuff and you think, oh, that's disordered. And you're like, is it? Or is that me coming at it? I think one of the issues we have is in our society, a lot of disordered eating is normalized,
It's wellness, it's health.
it's encouraged. Yep.
Yes.
You can hear all the podcasts about people telling you to do this intermittent fasting and that if you eat this vegetable, it's got these kind of like pesticides in it. And actually, you shouldn't eat red meat because blah, blah, blah. And this is carcinogenic. And you need to cut out these foods that you shouldn't really eat after this time. And all of this. And it's everywhere. So people will follow that advice thinking that's actually something that is like health promoting.
Mm,
I think people follow it like from really good intentions of like, oh, actually, yeah, I want to look after myself. You know, I want to feel healthier and live longer, etc. And maybe to some extent, some things might be helpful. Some of the things you hear, but there's so much of it going around that you can say like, okay, I've got to do this, and then I've got to do that. I've got to do this. I've got to do that, and then you start to follow one thing, and you start to feel good. So you go, oh, I'll do the next thing then, and then that next thing comes in, and you're like, oh yeah, that feels good, and then it escalates and spirals from there, and suddenly you've got all these rules around food and these things that you can't eat, and you feel guilty if you eat a certain thing,
mhm.
and then you're in the world of disordered eating. But actually, I was told to do this. This person was
Yeah.
saying it was good, and these people are often like people who have qualifications in nutrition and dietetics and health. So people are going to trust them, right?
Mhm.
Um, so that's why I think it's difficult because disordered eating can creep up on people just in the way an eating disorder can, and it can be promoted and normalized.
Yes.
Um, but I do agree with you that it's continuum. I feel like it's a continuum that isn't just disordered eating on one end and an eating disorder on the
Mm,
other. I think we've chosen to focus on two areas of that continuum. I think there's more to it, and something that this dietitian shared with us in our lecture the other week, which I thought was quite helpful. I'm not 100% sure in some of the language in it, but it was a sliding scale of like healthy relationship with food, unhealthy relationship with food, disordered eating, and then an eating disorder. And that was like the scale. Now, the reason I say I'm not sure about the language is because I'm not sure I'm too keen on the idea of healthy and unhealthy
Mhm.
because I think health, those words like healthy and unhealthy have so much weight to them. I'm not talking physical
Yeah.
weight here. Like there's so many connotations with them and so much
Mm.
morality attached to them that I don't know if they're the most helpful words. I don't know what words would be better. Yeah, maybe peaceful, stable relationship with
Mhm.
food. And I don't know, more of a inconsistent
Mhm.
or fluctuating relationship with food. I don't know. I don't know what terms are best, but I guess the idea of this scale is like a healthy relationship with food or peaceful or stable is this permission for all foods. There's variety in your diet of foods that are health promoting and foods that are more fun foods and they're not so health promoting, but they still exist and you can eat them without shame, without guilt, more of a holistic view of health and your worth is not attached to what you eat. There isn't any dieting going on. There's more of this kind of like feeling of being connected to your body and knowing what it needs and when and respecting that. So there is fluctuation in it. Like some days you might eat more, other days you
Mhm.
might eat less. Some days you
Mhm.
might eat more health promoting foods and other days less. So there is fluctuation, but this kind of groundedness feeling of like I don't feel like a panic around food. There's a sense of calm
Mhm.
around food and how I feel about myself in relation to that. Whereas the unhealthy relationship with food is, or whatever other word you want to use, like a unstable or inconsistent or whatever, is where you do have access to that peaceful place with food. However, there is periods where you may diet, and that might be like, oh, it's been New Year, and I'm going to go on a diet because I feel crap after Christmas or whatever, and everyone else is doing it. But you do it for a little bit of time, and then you don't continue with it. You don't really attach a lot of for me, it's like you don't really attach a lot of your self-worth to it. You might do it because you think, "Oh, I probably should because everyone else is doing it," but then you don't stick with it. It doesn't shake you in the sense of your self-worth is not affected by it. So another example might be someone doing it as a dieting before a wedding or a big event or before a holiday, but then they go on holiday and it doesn't worry them and they enjoy it and then they come back and they don't continue with the dieting. So there is some change in someone's behavior and actions, whereas in a peaceful state of food, there is action. I think in a peaceful state of food, you might have like fluctuations in how you feel about your body, but it doesn't lead to any
Mhm.
action, you know?
Mhm. Yes.
So that's how I'd view the unhealthy kind of relationship. We're going to use that in quotation marks. And then the next one is then you move into disordered eating, which for me, the big difference between this unhealthy place with food and disordered eating is the attachment to self worth. That when you move into disordered eating, there's a lot of your self worth attached in foods and how you're eating. You're either a good person or you're a bad person. If you eat in a certain way, you feel a lot of shame or guilt if you eat certain things. Your eating behaviors have changed a lot. There's a lot of morality placed around food, and you might be cutting out food groups. And the other thing is that it's quite consistent and it's like ongoing. Whereas in the unhealthy category, you might have these moments where you diet, but then you go back to a peaceful place. Whereas disordered eating, it's more of a consistent cutting out of a certain food group or a consistent kind of, I'll try this diet and then I might try that
Mhm.
diet. And, moving around different things. And there's a lot to disordered eating, which we can talk probably more about today. And then after that, it moves into an eating disorder. And an eating disorder is where there's clear clinical
Mm.
criteria that needs to be, I don't know, it might be even episode 2 or 3, where we talked about binge eating.
Yes.
We talked about what the clinical criteria was for binge eating and the clinical criteria for bulimia. So if you haven't listened to that episode, that actually might be helpful, a
Mhm.
helpful one to listen to after today. But obviously, there's also clinical criteria for anorexia. So an eating disorder would be when you've got to the point where actually you meet that clinical criteria. Um, Whereas not everyone who has disordered eating would meet that clinical criteria.
Mhm. Yes.
But everyone who has an eating disorder probably does have the aspects of disordered eating in there. That's how I view this scale.
Yes. And I think the difficulty is when the clinical terms come in with an eating disorder, as this came up when we talked about in the binge eating episode, the bit that always feels so frustrating is that you leave people in a position where they feel like they cannot get help,
Hmm.
um, or that they
Yeah.
feel they're not deserving of care, or that they feel like their eating issues, their behaviors around food, it's not bad enough. It needs
Hmm.
to be worse, which you're asking people to further solidify the thoughts and beliefs they have around food, which, as we know, are so hard to untangle. Once they set in, untangling it is so, so, so challenging. And you're invalidating people's experience. And this is where I can find I feel quite reluctant to label things. You're allowed to want a better relationship with food at any point within this spectrum, right? And I think that's the sticky point. Like, so long as something's impacting you, it can be very easy to fall in the comparison trap,
Hmm.
and to sort of downplay your symptoms. But all of that to say, like, we can't deny that resources are limited and that you have to
Yeah.
fit criteria. So although I sit here and say, like, you don't have to meet that criteria to feel like you warrant receiving help and acknowledging that you have an issue and that it's impacting your life and that it's something you want to change. But it's all very well wanting that versus actually accessing help
Yeah.
in order to do something about it. It's just frustrating. And I won't go off on a tangent about it because no one needs to hear that. But there's something about the labels that in part help you kind of gauge, like, where am I in this? That I do think is helpful and I do think it's necessary. But there's also that other side of it where it's like, where are you cutting off people and invalidating people's experiences? Because everyone's experience is going to be different to some extent. And depending on what's going on in your life, like, different stresses have different impacts. And it's just, and even as you said, like, in the way that you explained it, which is really helpful, to make it straightforward, unhealthy, healthy, disordered eating, eating disorder. But even that makes me feel like,
Hmm.
as you said, what's healthy though? Because right now it's warped.
Yeah.
I saw someone post online. They must have been a friend of mine because I don't know why else I would have been following them. But they posted about how they were out for dinner and everyone was having their food and they brought their own food. And they were like, this is discipline because I'm in the gym and I'm training. And I was like, that to me is unhealthy. That is disordered to me because
Mm.
it's impacting your life. But people were commenting like, "Oh, you're so on it," and it was
Yeah.
it was being praised, and I was like, "No, no, no, no.
Yeah.
What's going on
Yeah.
here? Go and eat some
Oh,
pizza and have your dinner, like, and socialize and connect with people because that is all part of the health umbrella, right? Like, being able to connect with people and being able to be present with people, and it's so warped that it's just somewhat infuriating to watch.
I'm going to say something that's quite bold here.
Do it.
I actually think the majority of our society lives in the unhealthy relationship with food or sliding into disordered eating.
Agreed.
I think it's very, very rare to find someone that has a peaceful, healthy relationship with food, that balanced, stable relationship with food. I actually feel like I do have that relationship with food.
Mhm.
I feel like the only reason I do is because I went through the disordered eating, eating disorder, and recovery. I think and in my experience, a lot of people who I have spoken to who have managed to find that place with food of peacefulness is because they've gone through the disordered stuff first and done the unlearning and got to this place.
Yes.
They're either that or they're someone that just food is just kind of a non-thought for them. They just eat when they're hungry and then that's it. And like they've never been influenced by any kind of idea of you should eat this for your health or any diet culture thing. And
Mhm.
that I will say it's more men
Yes,
than
I would
women.
agree. Yes.
Hmm. I think to go back to some of the other stuff that you said around, is it helpful to have these categories? So one of the things that was interesting is Christmas time when I was having this discussion with one of Will's relatives, they were asking like, no, but I need to know exactly what disordered eating is because what you're describing it as, which I described as, what I've said today around like morality attached to food. There's good foods, there's bad foods, cutting out food groups, feeling sort of guilt or shame after you've eaten certain foods, preoccupation with food, often thinking about food and feeling like, oh, well, if I eat this, then later on I want to do X, Y, Z because, I want to make it balanced, etc. All of that. And they were saying, but that's too vague for me. I need clear definition. And I understand that. And I think that's why some of these categories can be helpful because
Mhm.
we have this human nature to want clarity. We want to know exactly where we stand with things. Our brain likes to put things in boxes. So this sliding scale of these four categories is helpful to provide that. But the only place where we actually get to a real set, fixed definition is the eating disorder
Yes.
area, the eating disorder category, because there is a clinical criteria and that's the way like all kind of uh, they call them mental disorders, don't they? So
Mhm.
what the what they're classed as, they all have a set of criteria so we can know when someone meets that criteria to then need treatment, etc. However, I also agree with you. That's not necessarily helpful because I cannot tell you the amount of times that I spoke to people when I worked at Beat who needed support and desperately wanted to support for their relationship with food because they were riddled with guilt after they ate a certain food. They felt like if they went out for a meal on an evening with family, they couldn't eat for the whole day beforehand because they needed to like reduce their calories before they went out. Or the next day they felt like they should make up for it by going for a really long walk or going to the gym or whatever, or had this category of foods that were like, these are foods that are good and these foods are bad. And I need to avoid those foods and only eat these and put all this pressure on themselves. But because they didn't meet a fixed criteria for an eating disorder, they weren't being given treatment or help or support. And this is where then having those clear, fixed definitions, we might want them because our brain wants that and it might be helpful. So we can be like, oh, yes, tick, tick, tick. Here you go. Here's some treatment. But it's also not helpful because then it means there's so many people who just get missed in that system and don't get that support or don't believe that there's something that they really need support for, or we have to wait until they get further down that sliding scale into the point where they are in an eating disorder and those thoughts are so ingrained before they can have help. And then it's much harder to recover from that when you've gone that far into it for many reasons. Then actually, if you were to catch some of those beliefs and behaviors earlier on, it's much easier to support someone with it. And it just makes me really sad. And when I was in this lecture the other week, the lecturer said, that we have these fixed criterias, and in America they're really followed to the T because of insurance purposes. You can only get support if you meet them. She was like, whereas in the UK we don't follow them. And I was sat there like in my chair in this lecture hall, just raging, thinking that's not true because I have experienced this
Yeah.
like day in, day out with people. That is absolutely not true. And one of the biggest ones is the BMI, that people do not fall into a certain category in the BMI and then they get denied treatment. And it infuriates me
Oh, yeah, 'cause,
because the same
yeah.
things that someone in a larger body does is promoted and someone in a smaller body is
Yes.
like, oh, that's an eating disorder.
Yes. And it is infuriating, isn't it? And it's soul crushing, as you say. And I've had this with clients before where it's like, this person has a full blown eating disorder. All they're thinking about is food. It takes over their whole life. Everything is a calculation. Everything is like a mental gymnastics. It's exhausting. And yet, because of where they fall in the BMI, not only does it mean that they fall back into this idea of, I don't have a real problem here, they invalidate their own experience,
Mhm.
which is heartbreaking because it's like you're coming to me and you're distressed. We can't deny that experience, but we're downplaying it because you don't hit a number on a BMI chart.
Yeah.
And I mean, I even had that in my own experience where I was told that until my weight went under a certain scale, there's nothing they could really do.
Yeah.
And as you say, you're further solidifying disordered eating and disordered thoughts and this idea that like you just need to be bad enough before you can warrant support.
Yeah.
And it's just
And I don't think it's clinicians' faults and like
no.
therapists' faults or anything like that. I think people who work in this profession really do want
Mm,
to help. And if they could help people earlier, they would, but they're bound by a system that
yes.
doesn't allow that. And that's because to some extent, when we have a big system like a huge healthcare, there needs to be some structure to it, like
Yeah,
like any
absolutely.
big organization. And also part of that's also that they're understaffed, they're underfunded, so they can't provide it to everyone
Hmm.
who is experiencing disordered eating because that would be a lot of people. And it's not always the BMI that stops people. Sometimes, for example, in binge eating, it's the fact that they don't meet the criteria for how often they binge because the criteria is once a week for 3 months. Now, if I think about my time with binge eating, sometimes I would binge every single day, like, or sometimes multiple times a day. And then I might have a week where I didn't. And it fluctuated like that. I mean, I guess I'm hoping that they would do it whereas like, well, if we took this amount and spread it across 4 months, would that equate to once a week? But really, does it actually matter how often someone binges? Because actually, if they are binging and then they're purging, or even if they're just binging, that's still signifying that there's something here that this person needs support with. And someone could do it once a week or once a month, and that's still incredibly distressing for that
Yeah.
person to experience, you know?
Yeah.
I think that's another thing with the criteria around eating disorders is very behavior focused. It's not so much, again, because behavior is easy to quantify, isn't it?
Mm,
Whereas thoughts and feelings are less easy to quantify. So obviously the criteria is based on behaviors, but that doesn't really tell you the full picture. Doesn't really tell you the level of the distress that that person's feeling, you know, how often, how much of their brain space is occupied by food, how much of
mhm.
their self worth is attached to food. Now, a lot of that does come into treatment, that is addressed within treatment, but it's not necessarily a criteria. It's not the focus of criteria so much.
Yes.
It does exist there. I'm not saying it doesn't at all in criteria, but there's a definitely more like, yeah, it's just more behavior focused. But what I did want to say was recently, I don't know if you've seen this, but government has released kind of new guidance around eating disorder treatment in children and young
Mhm.
people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they've actually explicitly stated now that the BMI shouldn't be like a determining factor, that it should be the full picture that's taken into consideration. So the person's behaviors should
Mhm.
be
Mhm.
considered and they should still be given treatment, not necessarily focusing on the number, which is promising. However, that's only in children and young people. So what about adults? Also, how much of that gets put into practice? Because we can have a policy change, but whether it's actually then put into practice is a different thing. And it's still the focus is shouldn't be on the number, it should be on the behaviors, but then where's the thoughts and the feelings aspect as well? Like that's
Yes.
still kind of
Yes.
missing. And I'm pretty sure that the NICE guidelines have always stated that BMI should not be the only considered factor in determining whether
Mm.
someone gets treatment. And that isn't always followed because it is a determining factor in whether people get treatment or not. So there's a glimmer of hope there, but then we have to see what happens from there to
Yes,
see if it
whether it
actually needs
actually
to
gets
change.
put into play.
Yeah.
It's maybe going in the right direction.
I'm curious. Can I ask you a question
Of
then?
course you can. That's what
For
I'm here for.
you,
Mhm.
did you feel like your issues with eating went straight into eating disorder, or did you see yourself move through that process of sliding into unhealthy and then sliding into disorder and then ended up in eating disorder territory? Because a lot of the theory around eating disorders is no one starts off with an eating disorder. You can tend to slide into it. So it creeps up on you because no one goes, yes, I want an eating disorder. Well, actually, I can't speak. Some people might, but it's not particular. I don't want to speak on behalf of everyone, but most people probably wouldn't say, yes, I want to have an eating disorder. They may say, yes, I want to lose weight.
Hmm.
Yes, I want to eat less, but they wouldn't say, I want to have an eating disorder. Not straight away from the beginning, but it tends to be something that creeps up on people. Like the dieting starts, and then because of the dieting, like the preoccupation with food sets in, and then like these beliefs around foods develop, and then like guilt creeps in and self worth. Like, and then it creeps up, and then suddenly you're in an eating disorder, and you like, how have I got here? That's
Yes.
what people often talk about. Now, I'm wondering if that was how it was for you, or whether you feel like it was different and you just fell straight into an eating disorder.
So I would say that I remember growing up and feeling like I thought about food a lot, and I would have episodes of binging, but it wasn't really something that I thought much about at the time. And then going into secondary school and learning about like calories and understanding if you eat less, then you lose weight. I remember starting to implement that purely out of it gave me a sense of not only control, but this idea of I'm doing something and it's manipulating my body. I'm doing this to get a certain outcome. But I remember it getting very extreme very quickly. In a matter of a few months, it went from being disordered to quite extreme in disordered eating. It was a bit of a game for me, is what it was. It wasn't necessarily about the weight. I don't recall at this stage weighing myself a lot, but I remember feeling quite excited at the idea of, "Oh, I'm not going to eat as much today because I can control that." I remember eating and every day planning to cut back a little bit more the next day, and portions getting smaller and smaller, and it feeling quite exciting for me.
Mm.
Um, and so that's what it was. And I think as well, I mean, I was like in my early teens, I had no real concept of disordered eating or an eating disorder. Like an eating disorder for me was you're anorexic and you're skin and bone and you
Mm.
don't eat at all, or you're bulimic and you make yourself sick after every meal. Like it was this very generic kind of basic idea of what an eating disorder was. There was nothing more to it. So I didn't think I had an eating disorder. Um,
Yeah.
as I say, it was all just quite exciting for me. There was the thrill of it. And so, of course, that very quickly snowballed. And then I remember noticing I quite enjoy the cutting back, but then it feels like the only way forward is to keep cutting back. Like it doesn't feel good to increase or it doesn't feel good to stay the same. That feels quite nerve wracking for me. And that feels like that's an issue. And then feeling like this isn't really something I feel like I'm dictating anymore. This feels like it's something that's becoming me and I'm not really getting a say in this and going along with it because that created less mental anguish than the battle of I've eaten more than I did yesterday.
Yeah. 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 I think what you sort of said there on it was a bit of a game with yourself, and then it became exciting, a thrill. I think that is one of the one of the dangers with dieting and following certain nutritional advice,
Mm.
or wellness advice, and where people then can slide further down that scale, or continuum, is because people do get that buzz and they do feel great, whether it's a mental thing or it's a physical thing or it's both. Even things like, say, you've eaten more highly palatable foods, or what people would call like ultra processed foods. Say you've eaten more of them in your life, and then you suddenly cut them all out. Your body's going to suddenly feel different, right? Because you've just drastically
Mm.
changed what's going on, and you feel good. And then you're like, oh, but I feel good. Like that feels nice. So what's the next thing then?
Yeah.
Like, what's
What
the
else
next
can
thing
I
I can
do?
do? What else can I cut out or change that's going to also make me feel good? So then you move on to the next thing, and then you get a bit of a buzz again. And And then it builds and you spiral from there. And then this is where it's hard because you don't realize until then it's years down the line. And actually, you've been depriving yourself of all of these certain foods,
Mm.
certain nutrients, because your body can survive without certain things for quite a long time
Mm.
before you really start to notice the effects of it. So, say, for example, carbs, you can survive for quite a while and until you then start to feel the effects of it. After some time, you you don't realize, oh, actually, yeah, like I really miss actually being able to just go out with family and have a pizza or eat a bag of
Mhm.
crisps or eat some chocolate without feeling like really uneasy about it. The beginning, you don't feel like that when you're cutting these things out. You
Mm.
feel the excitement, you feel the buzz, and then it builds and builds. And then it's actually years down the line later where you're like, God, I feel really depleted all the time, or just feel hungry all the time, or feel cold, or just feel like every time I see those foods, I'm like, I just want to eat them all. I want to ravish them all. And I feel like I can't control myself. It's like you don't feel that at the beginning, you feel it later. But by
Mm.
that point, later on, those beliefs have become really solidified. And I think that's the tricky thing. That's how it creeps up on you.
I think as well, because of the messaging that we've got, particularly now within this very toxic wellness culture that's also now being conflated with health, the lines are so blurred that when you start to feel that depletion and when you start to feel like this is becoming hard, instead of really thinking, what's going on here? Like, am I eating enough food? There's a reason why I'm always wanting the donuts in the bakery and then it's all I can think about all day. And like, there's a reason, like, what is this? Instead of that being the mentality, it tends to be, what else do I need to cut out? Or what other rule do I
Yes.
need to bring in? Maybe the answer is cold plunges. Maybe the answer is intermittent fasting. Like, we then can
Yeah.
spiral even more into finding something. We're like, maybe you just need to eat more food. Maybe you're not eating enough. And maybe you need to
Yeah.
like work on permission and have the donut in the bakery that you've been thinking about all week. I think this idea that we have complete control over our health and our bodies, that it feels like the solution is always within us and our means of accessing that is through food, that
Mhm.
we think that, well, I just need to do all these healthy things. I need to only eat the healthy foods and then I will feel XYZ, when
Yeah.
it's just far more complicated than that. I think that unfortunately, the very difficult reality is we think we have far more control over our health outcomes than we actually do. And so I think that ties in with a sense of security with food, where it's like if I do all the right things with food, if I do all these healthy things, then I'm promised like longevity and disease free life. And I think there's far more that impacts our health outcomes and things that factors we don't even have control over and get a say in that can have an influence here.
It's all relevant. I think, yes, we can have influence over our health.
Mm.
And I don't think it's a bad thing to want to have influence over your
Mm.
health. And I think that's one of the misconceptions that there is about people like us who work in this field and promote, you know, intuitive eating and a more holistic view of health. That it's like, oh well, you're encouraging everyone to go and eat whatever they want when they want, and all this food that's not very health promoting. No, it's not. Like that's not what we're saying. We acknowledge that certain foods are more health promoting than others, and yeah, it's not wrong to want to look after your health and care for yourself, and you can have some influence over your health. For example, you can smoke and you know that that's going to potentially put your health at risk, and you cannot smoke and actually that's more health promoting. So we can have some influence. But you are right, there's big factors that we don't have influence over. Some of that's genetic, some of it's environmental, etc. So we do have to surrender to that to some extent. And absolutely what you said around how healthy is the stress? Because
Mm.
food is a really easy place to try and focus health because it's something that you have to prepare every single day, multiple times a day. It's just really accessible. It's really easy, and there's lots of information out there that you can go right. Well, I'll focus on this. It's how I can control my health. Focusing on things like stress is harder because it's not as concrete, is it? Like you can go online and someone can say, "Oh, only eat this amount of carbs with every meal," or "Cut out red meat." Great. That's a clear cut rule that I can follow. Whereas things around stress and managing stress is more introspective. It's less rigid and rule bound, and it's more personalized. Yes, of course, there's general things you can do to reduce stress, but does require going inwards more. And I think that's harder and it's more
Mm,
nuanced and it's a bit messier. But I do agree that if you are spending all of your time thinking about food and feeling like you can't fully enjoy a social event without having a niggling thought about how many calories you've eaten or how much fat was in something, or how's that going to affect your health, or what do you need to do to counteract that? That is a stress that's just running on
yeah.
in your mind in the background. And actually, we have so much research to show now that stress above everything else, food, diet, whatever, it is one of the biggest
Mm,
causes of ill health and death in people. But again, stress is something that creeps up on you. You don't realize you're
yeah.
in a
Okay.
chronic state of stress
Yeah.
until it's much later down the line. And actually, your nervous system's just got used to being like that. So you
Yes.
don't realize there's any different way to be.
Yes. Exactly. Um, I'm
That's why we
curious.
have these conversations, hopefully, to help people like reflect on this and be like, oh, does that apply to me? Or
Mhm.
no, maybe that doesn't. I can neglect that. Or actually, like just to spark, like, I think the purpose of these conversations we have is just to spark thoughts in people.
Oh, yeah. And for people to find relatability, and if it
Find their own
means
answers.
yeah, 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 exactly that, exactly that. I'd be curious to know, Becca, about you and your experience, because I've talked about how it felt for me going from disordered eating into an eating disorder and what that was like for you, whether it was more of a slow burn or whether it was something that was a bit more intense than that.
I think mine was more intense.
Mm,
I'm not saying there was like, I went from like peaceful, healthy relationship to food straight into eating disorder. It was not as clear cut as that,
mm,
but it wasn't as much of a gradual slippery slope for me, I don't think. And that's purely because mine was so wrapped up in trauma as well.
mm, yeah.
Um, but the reason I asked around this is because, again, research really consistently shows now that dieting is the biggest preceding factor for an eating disorder. So therefore, I'm not saying everyone who diets is going to get an eating disorder, but dieting does not come without risks and potential consequences later down the line, physically and mentally. And also want to put into that dieting doesn't necessarily have to be what I think sometimes people think dieting is like, that I'm following the Special K diet or I'm following Slimming World. Dieting can just
Mhm,
be trying to reduce your food intake in any way, either through restricting calories, cutting out food groups, only eating at certain times of the day. That is all dieting. That all falls under the umbrella of dieting. All of that is the biggest preceding factor for people developing eating disorders. And
yes.
not to say that you 100% will. But I wanted to state that. That's why I think it's important for us to discuss, like, how did you get into it? Was the
Mm,
dieting first and then you ended up in eating disorder or not? So for me, to go back to your question, I think I had a relatively stable relationship with food, through my childhood and my early adolescence. Like I remember me and my best friend at the time, like every Wednesday we used to go down to like the local um town and we used to get fish and chips and we used to sit and eat it. And there was never any guilt. It was just pure enjoyment and fun. And I didn't then restrict the next day or feel bad about it. Nothing like that. And that was like right into my teens, and used to go to my grandparents and love having like all the food and like big portions. And there was a lot of I was very relaxed around food. But there was, as I got into like end of primary school, beginning of secondary school, I think I spoke about it in one of our earlier episodes around having like bridesmaid dress fitting. And that was
mhm,
one area that one of my earliest memories about really being conscious of my body. But that kind of body dissatisfaction and body worry started to creep into me for me, and comparing myself to others and thinking, well, I'm bigger than other people.
mhm,
Um, I was taller as well than other girls, and that just made me feel bigger. And I don't really have large breasts, and I didn't develop until much later. So there was that comparison there of like, well, I'm not. I'm taller than everyone and bigger than everyone, but my breasts are smaller. So like, what's wrong with my body? And, there was a lot of this comparison piece and a lot of dissatisfaction, which I think does happen to some extent naturally as people go through puberty because your
Mhm.
body's changing. And that is a confusing time for anyone who's going through puberty. And again, I think a reason why significant amount of eating disorders develop around puberty age, because it's a very like unstable time in what's going on with your body and hormones and everything like that. So that was all there. But my food choices, it didn't really translate into my food choices. I was still quite relaxed with food, had that niggling body dissatisfaction. And then it was more like my mid to late teens where it then started to shift. And again, I spoke about this in an early episode, so I won't go into too much detail. But I had an experience with a personal trainer at the gym, really shook me up. And that was the first time I was like, oh my God, I'm going to restrict. Like there's something wrong with my body. I need to lose weight, etc. That's when I first restricted. And then it was kind of like a series of events. Like that happened. And then my parents separated, which was like a huge disruption trauma to go through. My first ever boyfriend cheated on me. Then I got sexually assaulted. And that was all in the space of like just a couple of years. So I kind of went from body dissatisfaction and but a peaceful relationship with food to very quite quickly binging, purging. That was it. So it was quite a quick catapult for me. And I purely think that's because the trauma of everything going on, like the binging and the purging was like such a cathartic release
Mm.
for me. It was like the only way I knew how to actually like express how I was feeling. Like it felt like I got to release some emotions through doing that process. It was the way I coped with it. But then there was also the restriction outside of it. And I think was I wouldn't have worded it this way at the time, but it was feeling like everything around me is completely out of my control. I feel completely unsafe and disoriented in this world. So what can I do to try and feel some sense of safety and predictability? I'm going to put it onto food. So yeah, it was quick. It was a quick catapult for me. That
Really quick.
yeah, it was quite quick. However, I can look back in my childhood and see that there was some seeds being planted around food and body that were probably why I got catapulted into it so quickly. So I do remember having experiences of being made, being kind of intentionally made to feel guilty around certain food when I
Mm.
was younger, but it didn't really affect me too much. Like it didn't land and develop as a belief at that age, or hearing people talk about foods being good and foods being bad and talking about certain body sizes being good and certain body sizes not. And my kind of work as a woman or a
Mm.
female in my body. So I can see how those earlier little seeds might not
Mm.
have affected me for a very long time. But then when the trauma happened, I went into the food,
Yeah. Sounds like
you know?
it was the catalyst, and then it was full on, wasn't it? I don't think
Mm,
you started in disorder, you went straight into eating disorder as a way of,
yeah.
as you say, managing the way that in which you were feeling. Very heavy
Yeah.
feelings as well, very intense. A lot going on in one short period of time for anyone to try and handle.
Yeah. And I think then from that point, from my mid to late teens, right till my sort of my late 20s, I struggled with food in various different ways.
Mm.
And certain times, I was clinically diagnosed with bulimia. I was never clinically diagnosed with binge eating disorder, but I can see, knowing what the criteria is, there were times where I met that criteria and times where I didn't, but there was always disordered eating at play.
Yes, I really would agree with you. Like from my own experience, you're never not in any sort of dysregulated place with food. It's just, it can go in ebbs and flows of being a bit more extreme and more heightened, and then being a little bit less so. But it's never at a point where like I wasn't not thinking about food or monitoring food to some capacity.
Yeah, before I
Mm.
went through, are you talking about before
Yes,
recovery?
yes. Yeah. Oh God, no, not now. No, I'm
Yeah.
fine.
I just wanted to clarify that. It's just
No, I'm all
because
good now.
the way you worded it made me think you were saying there's never a point where you're
No.
not dysregulated. But you
No,
meant
no,
in the
find out. In the pre-recovery, pre-recovery.
yeah.
Yes.
But I think that's why I sort of say when I was in my eating disorder, because I just view that all as like, well, that's the easiest way
Yeah.
to see it because that
Yes.
encapsulates everything, you know?
Yes. Yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
Yeah. Well, I hope it's been helpful for people to hear. I don't know. Have we actually clarified the
I don't
difference or
know.
have we made it
I was
more
about to say, I hope you
confusing?
have more clarity. I think you provided a lot of clarity, I would say.
I hope so. Well, actually, if you're listening, tell us whether we made it more confusing or whether we made it clearer. And in particular, I'm going to send this to a family member I spoke to and
Oh
say,
my gosh, are you?
did that make it any clearer or have
They'll
I just made
probably
it more
go
messy? Because
no. They'll
apologies
probably
if I
say
have.
no. They'll probably say no, and you've just wasted an hour of my time in the process.
Hopefully not, but yeah,
Oh
we
God.
we tried.
Let us know what you think, as always.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, guys.
Thanks. Bye.